Thank you for tuning into our podcast, Canal Days, What Life Was Like in the Industrial Connecticut River Valley of Massachusetts. I am your host, Carrie, and joining us today is Holyoke's very own local historian and creator of the historical tours of Greater Holyoke, Robert Como. He personally offers and leads public and private tours, as well as presentations of historical sites within communities throughout the state of Massachusetts. Currently, the communities he has chosen to focus on this year are Holyoke, Chicopee, South Hadley, and East Hampton, and also Granby and Amherst as well. His tours spotlight the local canals, reservoirs, cemeteries, and churches, as well as various park streets and selected historical houses within each community. In today's episode, we'll be discussing the Meeting House Hill Cemetery, located in West Springfield, Massachusetts. So, Bob, tell us about the cemetery.
All right, this cemetery here, called the Meeting House Hill Cemetery, of course, is on the hill. It's next to this beautiful church. And that church is on Elm Street, opposite of the King's Highway. The streets of West Springfield are fairly jumbled around. And it's thought that this cemetery was made in 1808. This is probably not the original church. It probably was elsewhere. They brought one in and then they replaced it with this one sometime mid to late 1800s. And the cemetery, though, has been there since 1808, and we want to learn about that. All right, now this is the kind of cemetery is best learned by just going there and seeing a lot of the wonderful features that are around it. And that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about the cemetery's relationship to the church and the Civil War monument within the church, the cemetery, and then what are some of the sections within this cemetery that might apply and you might want to learn more about. Now, I hope to someday have a tour around this cemetery and to build up the page for this cemetery so you can see a lot of the features. Right? So walk around on your own and walk around that church and down the little lane called Witch's Path and learn as much as you can and look at my page for help.
And tell us about the relationship to the church.
All right, that church is, like I said, maybe from the mid to late 1800s, all right, and the personages that are on Witch's Lane, the second one ever made is down the end of that lane. The third one ever made is at the top corner of that lane. I don't know what the first one is. It's not the house across the street from it, which is old, but it's not that one. So I don't know what the first one was. But we're talking mostly about the cemetery, and this is definitely a churchyard style cemetery, where you have the cemetery right alongside the church. And very few of these are left in Massachusetts. Usually these kind of cemeteries were moved into new gorgeous cemeteries called garden style cemeteries. But in West Springfield, it's still there. In fact, West Springfield has two of them. And this one is not, it's like the third or fourth oldest cemetery within West Springfield, which has a lot of very old cemeteries. And the relationship between the two is thus that the people buried here were parishioners at that church. And they would have been buried right from the start around 1808 coming forwards. And it's a very large cemetery. So a lot of people have attended this church, and they don't do that anymore. So the people being buried here now are people that might have deeds to some of the plots within it. And it's very filled up at this point, so there's probably only a few new burials every year or so.
And really quick, before we continue with the rest of our interview, just to fill our listeners in, for more information or to sign up for any various tours, you can check out his website at holyokecanaltour.org. And there you can find videos and podcasts of the stops along each of his tours, as well as photos and text of the historical sites throughout as well. And for private tours and other inquiries, you can email him directly at bobcat4214, capital B, @yahoo.com. And his tours make for fun educational outdoor activities for families and group parties. So getting back to our interview. So tell us about the Civil War monument within the cemetery.
It's a beautiful brownstone obelisk and it has on the sides of it the names of the men from West Springfield that went off to the Civil War and died from illnesses or injuries caused by that Civil War. And there's many names on here. I would guess there's about 30 to 35 different names on here. And each of the slides have different names and explains that one slide died of the wounds in action, one slide died of illnesses during the war, and so forth. So each side is different. Each side has their rank, then it has the first and last name, and then it has the month, date, and year that that person died. Now, these men are not buried in a cemetery, so this is a monument. And that means that they're buried, in most cases, elsewhere. Some of the men are buried here, all right, but the vast majority are buried in cemeteries in the southern United States or in other cemeteries around the area. A lot of these men here entered the war. They were born in West Springfield. They lived most of their life in West Springfield, but they entered through a regiment in Holyoke. So a lot of these are West Springfield men and Holyoke men. So a lot of these names are repeated over and over again around the valley, especially they're on a monument in the middle of Veterans Park in Holyoke, where a monument, a Statue of Columbia, has the name of many men outside of it. So this is easy to find. It's front, off to the side, and it's fun to walk around it and read all the inscriptions on it. And by intent, there's other burials around the very edge of it that have to do with wars. So read all their names and learn about them as much as you can. I'm trying to build up a grid of information.
What are some of these sections?
Okay, some of the sections inside here include the Potter's Field, which is where the paupers were buried. That is towards the back, very close to the edge of the woods. There's also a very large family section towards the back, so don't misidentify that. And that large family section is by far the best family section within the cemetery, so make sure you check that out. It has a lot of barrels, one family, and they're all in a wrought iron fence around it. It's not very high. It's only about maybe a foot high, but it includes the Southworth family mostly, and that name was big around West Springfield. Then, of course, there's the monument section, and remember that as old cemeteries go, usually you have a lot of the barrels scattered around. Since this is a churchyard cemetery, people are buried by family relationships. And so you might have some old burials and some newer ones with it. And then you walk forward, you have old burials and newer ones with it, which is very unlike a lawn cemetery. And there you'll see them ranked very much in order by the date of burial of the person. But here you're not going to get that sense. So it's one of the few cases where you can actually look at an old churchyard burial and see its properties.
And thank you, Robert, for educating us on your tours and historical topics of your expertise. And we want to thank our sponsors as well. And of course, we want to thank our listeners for tuning in. And check out a large selection of our other podcasts on his website as well as on SoundCloud.com. And be sure to stay up to date with new podcasts and videos posted daily. Thank you, and hope you join us again. Thank you for tuning into our podcast, Canal Days, What Life Was Like in the Industrial Connecticut River Valley of Massachusetts. I'm your host, Carrie, and joining us today is Holyoke's very own local historian and creator of the historical tours of Greater Holyoke, Robert Comu. He personally offers and leads public and private tours, as well as presentations of historical sites within communities throughout the state of Massachusetts. Currently, the communities he has chosen to focus on this year are Holyoke, Chicopee, South Hadley, and East Hampton, and also Granby and Amherst as well. His tours spotlight the local canals, reservoirs, cemeteries, and churches, as well as various parks, streets, and selected historical houses within each community. In today's episode, we'll be discussing the West Springfield First Parish Church, located in West Springfield, Massachusetts. So, can you tell us some of the different names the churches has had throughout the years?
Yes, it had a lot of names, including the one we just said, was Springfield First Parish Church. And it also became the White Church. That was a name applied to both as a nickname and as a name they would use officially. And then it became the West Springfield Masonic Temple. And then it became a private home, which still remains to this day. Next to it, of course, is the cemetery and a couple of the former parsonages nearby, and we'll talk about those. And we'll also talk about what might be important around this neighborhood. It's some colonial homes around this neighborhood and some Victorian homes, and we would like to mention some of those to you. And hopefully you'll learn a lot, but of course the best thing is just go there, walk around it. For people that live there probably are used to people staring at their homes and walking around the cemetery. And of course it has a great street on it called Witch Path. And that obviously will attract people.
And where has the parsonage formerly been located?
Okay, so the first parsonage that served this First Parish Church, I don't know where it is. It might have been taken down. It's not the one that's across the street. It's also a very old home. But I know where the second and third parsonages are. The first parsonage, the second one is from 1873, and that's at 43 and 45 Witch Path. And this third parsonage is up at the corner of Elm Street, Witch Path, and that one is from the year 1894. So both the second and third ones are still around, and they're still nice to look at. They look very old, and you may get a creepy sense from being on Witch Path of all things. All right, now someday I hope to know where that first parsonage was, and I hope to get a picture of it and put it on my webpage for this.
And really quick, before we continue with the rest of our interview, just to fill our listeners in, if you want to sign up for any of his various tours or find out more information, you can check out his website at holyokecanaltour.org. And there you can find videos and podcasts of the stops along each of his tours, as well as photos and text of the historical sites throughout as well. And for private tours and other inquiries, you can email him directly at bobcat4214, capital B, at yahoo.com. And his tours make for educational outdoor activities for families and group party. So getting back to our interview, define the church's relationship with the White Church Cemetery.
It's a churchyard cemetery, hard to find around Massachusetts anymore. A lot of them might have existed in the past, but here's one that has not moved very much. And so you get to look at an old-time cemetery right outside a church. Now, a lot of countries have this. Great Britain has it in all its provinces. Quebec province in Canada has this a lot. France has this a lot. And the United States, in the very old cemeteries that have not been moved, you have this a lot. They used to be much more common. For instance, Springfield had one, but it was moved. And Chicopee had one, but it was moved. And then I know that Ludlow had one, moved. South Hadley had one, it was moved. Holyoke had one, it was moved. All right, a lot of cemeteries have been moved away from the old churches, but in West Springfield's case, you get an old church next to an old cemetery. Very hard to find. And remember how common this would have been. Almost every community would have had one of these. Nowadays, very hard to find. So if you go there, you get a look at something very unique. And I hope you can go around the church and then walk through the cemetery and get the sense of the relationship between the two, how close some of the stones are to this left side of the church. And get a sense of how far back some of the burials are. And imagine yourself, some of the pioneers in this area are buried here, and what it must have been like to visit. Back then, plots were given out for families, and thus you have a mix of very old with some kind of middle age and newer stones in the area.
And describe the surrounding neighborhood of the church's vicinity.
Most importantly, across the street from the church at 10 King Highway is a home from the year 1756. It's one of the oldest homes around the Connecticut River Valley, and definitely one of the oldest ones in West Springfield that's left. It's the former home of Jer Stebbins. Now, this is not the original location of the house, and that's what makes it incredible. Originally, it was down near the Connecticut River itself, and he had moved up towards the church. And the reason why is that he wanted to be able to sell it to the church when the church came around, but the church never bought it. And so he moved the house to be bought, and then it was never sold to who he wanted to sell to, the church. And this could have been rectory number 2. I don't know where rectory number 1 is still, but I do know one little mystery. You have a house that wanted to be a rectory. That's incredible. So you have a lot happening at this area. You have a Witch's Path with 2 former parsonages, and you have the old cemetery around it, and you have this wannabe old style home that's older than even colonial homes. It's a Georgian style home, and it's still around and still in fairly great shape. So what a combination. And one of my favorite pictures ever taken of West Springfield is from the back of the cemetery looking towards the church. What a spectacular look, having all these gravestones and a beautiful church in the middle of it, the white church.
And thank you, Robert, for educating us on your tours and historical topics of your expertise. And we want to thank our listeners for tuning in. And you can check out a large selection of our other podcasts on his website, as well as on SoundCloud.com. And be sure to stay up to date with new podcasts and videos posted daily. Thank you, and hope you join us again.